Hi everyone, this is Adriana.
And this is Tania.
Welcome back to Closing the Gap, a social justice podcast that focuses on finding solutions to combat inequalities in our everyday lives. When we work together to address these issues, we are able to collectively heal as a whole and better our society for everyone. Today is a very special episode because it will be our last episode for the season. If we can't believe it, the year went by so fast, and we're really happy to have had you all along with us on this journey. We will be coming back for season two, more details to come there. But yeah, we're just really thankful for all of you for listening.
Definitely. I didn't expect a season to last a year. I know we planned for it to be like, we'll release 2 episodes a month, and then it ended up being one a month, and then some months we skip. I think it's just because that just shows how much we really like intention that we put in these episodes. We're not just releasing things just to release, we really want to make sure that we take good care of what we're saying. We double check everything that we're saying. We're not trying to like put out misinformation or put out bad vibes. I guess we really do care about like not only what we're saying because to keep our brand or whatever, our own like values, like just for ourselves, but for your sake. Because if this is a conversation with all of you involved as well, we want you to be a part of that conversation and we want to hear your feedback. So that's what's important to us as well. Whenever people tell us, oh, I didn't think about it this way, or they tell us, you had a good point, but also you forgot about this. I love hearing that because it's like, you're right. This is how we all learn together. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that we're kind of just going as it goes. We love connecting with people and just seeing where it leads. And so we'll see if we have more structure next season. But honestly, if we don't, I think it's going to be just as amazing, if not more, because at least now what we have is all of you, a great community.
Just to add on just a little bit more, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any comments or suggestions for episodes or anything like that. Like, again, we're trying to kind of form a community and just a resource for all of you. Like, we want to be here for you. We understand every day there's something going on and we try to be mindful of it. So please, like, know that the purpose of this is to be disposable to you and the community. So we're always here and we can't wait to see what the future brings for Closing the Gap.
Heck yes, this is just the beginning.
Woo-hoo. So, going to bring us into our final episode. It's a very important topic to us. We really wanted to hone in on what it's like to identify as a quote unquote minority here in the US. It has so many different implications and there's so many different layers to it. So we thought it would be very interesting to kind of dive into it for our last episode, especially since we do fall into this category. So yeah, we're really excited to dive into this. I'm sure a lot of you can also relate to some of the things that we're going to be sharing.
Yeah, for for those who might be wondering, why is Adriana using quote unquote minority? It's probably because of me. I tend to not use this word. I think it's a bit outdated, to be honest. I've been seeing better words. I think it's because minority, when you think of minority, you think of majority, right? So minority versus majority. And so you think of, oh, well, it's less people, less in numbers. I mean, we think of minorities, we tend to think of either by race, so Black and brown, or either by ethnicity. So we have Latinos or Middle Easterns, immigrants in general when it comes to the US, or we have gender, so women or non-gender, non-binary, LGBTQ plus. So you think of all those communities. And when we think about all those communities as a collective, we are not the minority like at all, right? Like we're very much the majority. Yeah.
Statistically speaking, yes. Okay. I guess technically still in the US, the majority, again, quote unquote, is still predominantly white. But if you look at the US population, where there's so many people here in this country, minority groups account for millions of people. So if you're not taking into consideration these groups, you're discounting millions of people. And that's just at the point that we are here in the US. We might have a biased viewpoint because California is a big melting pot, and I assume that's how the US as a whole is. In a way, it is, but we do have those pocketed areas where, again, it is predominantly white, more like in the South, more in the Midwest, those areas. And despite all of that, there are still minority communities and they deserve voices, even though they don't account for, again, the majority of those populations there. They still deserve a seat at the table. They still deserve voices because their lives are impacted by these policies. I think at times politicians and all of the policies that a lot of predominantly white Americans try to push on, they don't realize the implications it has on someone's life that doesn't necessarily look like them. And I love that this generation is becoming more aware of like why it's important to be more cognizant of these laws and what policies are being pushed. But when you turn it around and you question people who are trying to force things like the overturning of Roe versus Wade and things like that, they don't realize the implications they have. Like they're making policies for other people, not themselves, you know?
Yeah, and even when the minority, even when racialized or marginalized, underserved communities, all these communities we were talking about, even when they are the majority in an area, so even when they're in an area that's mostly Black or brown, they still have policies that work against them because of just how things are set up. And it's purposefully set up that way to leave them in an area that's neglected so they can stay there. And then, 10-minute drive over there to a different area that's predominantly white, predominantly affluent or whatever, it's completely different resources, completely different policies that work towards that community, for that community, and work actively against to keep the other community out through policing, through just barriers, having, schools that don't have as many resources to make sure the kids are stuck in a cycle of poverty, to make sure there aren't as many opportunities. So it's also like, it's never just quantity of numbers, right? And I think that's why this word, I tend to not use the word minority. I think that's why, because even when there is a majority of a certain group, if it's not white males or if it's not any other group that's technically higher on the ladder per se, the group that's below on the ladder still tends to like just not get as many resources as they should. So yeah, I tend to use marginalized a lot. I tend to use, and that's just because what I just explained, they're actually like on the margins and they're put there for a reason. Underserved communities, I use that as well. It's self-explanatory, right? They're literally underserved. What else do I use? I'm trying to think. There are so many other terms that we could be using, and underrepresented, and another one if we're talking about politics. And the last thing I'll say about that is what Adriana is saying is very important, and that every vote counts, and we know that every vote counts, and we know that things would be different if every vote counted,
Yes,
because they are actively working to take away our vote. We actually see it more in places where the majority is Black, right? Where the majority is brown. In places like Georgia, where they greatly reduced access to ways to vote, such as drop-off boxes that make it easier for people to vote. And this reduction was greatly seen in counties that were majority Black. So in California here, you can automatically vote mail-in ballot, which is super easy. It gets mailed to your house. You can fill it out at home. You can take your time and then mail it back. You don't have to worry about taking a day off work. You don't have to worry about getting to the polling place. Transportation can cost money as well. So it's very convenient for us. We're very privileged to be in this state. But that's not the case for other states. A lot of people have to wait in long lines, in the cold, in the heat. Some kind of forced to take a day off work so they don't get to vote. That's not how it's supposed to be. We're doing something for the community. We're taking part in this democratic process that this country is supposed to have. So like, why should we have to like go out of our way to do that? It should be as easy as possible. And they're actively making sure it's not for specific communities for a reason.
And again, they like to hide behind saying like, oh, it's specifically with that case, like we're trying to protect against voter fraud. But really, come on, like we know what you're doing. I believe more so back then, but I'm not sure now. I think back then they even like required you to take tests in order to qualify.
Oh yeah.
To vote. So it's just a matter of like taking away their voices. And it just goes to show too how these communities are so big. And that's why a lot of these opposing groups tend to target them, because they know if we were to like actually be able to express our concerns and voice what we need, they would be completely different. And that's why, although these underrepresented communities might be smaller number wise, if we're looking overall at the whole country, despite that we are here, we're present, we take up space, we still account for a lot of people. So it is important that we continue to push and ensure that like our voices are heard.
Oh, for sure. Those literacy tests were created during the Jim Crow era. So right after slavery, when formerly enslaved people were supposed to be free. And that was just one of the many obstacles to prevent Black people from actually being free and represented. And then I also wonder why certain populations are the minority, considering there's been so much genocide, considering there's been so much persecution, considering so many bodies are locked up and have even less of a say than any of us. If we're the minority, it's probably not our decision to be. It's probably because they're just trying to get rid of us. And this feels like a whole conspiracy, but like just putting it into perspective, I guess, like language is super powerful. Yes. And I'm really careful about the words that I use. And these are the words that are used by them, right? They use the word minority, and I think it's for a reason. And so I think that's why I'm actively trying to not use it. And also I've been seeing more studies of how, I mean, we already know the US has been changing for years when it comes to populations wise, just according to the census, people leaving in and out. But also from what I've seen, the Latino population is for sure growing. And I think also a lot of people just don't realize their backgrounds. When we can't know, like, because of immigration, because of genocide, or all these different things, who our ancestors were, you may not know you're Native American, but you may actually well be. I think that plays into that, because if you don't know what you are, you will not represent it, right? You won't put it on the census, you won't tell people, may not look like it, quote unquote. And so that does change things as well. It's a constantly changing field that we have to navigate, knowing who we are, who our communities are, where we lie, and how to support each other in solidarity.
Yeah, definitely. I think you bring up a really good point. And how you mentioned earlier, there's so many different underrepresented communities, whether it comes from ethnicity, race, sexual orientation. There's so many ways that you end up kind of falling into these categories. And to your point, sometimes we don't even realize it. We don't realize the community that we might identify with is underrepresented. And it even comes down to an even location based. I think here in California, we're a little bit in a bubble, but in other places within the US, it's a completely different ballgame for other communities. So it is important to understand where you come from and who you feel like you identify as. And I think that's why this is a really important topic for us, because, I think I can speak for the both of us that we do identify as part of these underrepresented communities, specifically being a part of like the Latin community. It's taken me a while, and it goes into trauma. We don't need to go too deep into it, but looking back, I understand now like why some of my experiences played out the way that they did. Mm-hmm. And why in certain spaces I felt uncomfortable or I felt out of place. And that's why it's really important to have these types of conversations, because it is valid, everything that we're feeling. And sometimes here in the US, I think you can agree, Tanya, we're taught that like it's not that big of a deal, or we're the land of the free, we're not racist anymore. I feel like there's comments like that all the time, like, what are you talking about, we're so progressive, yet we have so many, again, going back to the policy, so many communities are being attacked. As of right now in Tennessee, they're trying to ban drag. That's a complete direct hit to the LGBT plus community. Like, how are you saying that yes, maybe we are progressing in certain ways, but there still is those hateful agendas that are still being pushed through. Mm-hmm. So.
Oh yeah, hands down. There's always going to be backlash whenever progress is made, because people know when progress is made, they have to give up something. I don't think they have to give up what they think they're giving up. I think people think they give up. Yes, you give up your power and privilege. I want to personally give up my power and privilege. I know I have privilege and power. I do not want it. I am actively working to get rid of it. Do I think that's going to make me like less comfortable? Maybe in certain ways, but I think I'm going to gain so much if all of that is just gone. I think I'd gain so much if I no longer have to feel like, am I white passing or not white passing? Am I, living in a richer country as I watch poorer countries drown because of the policies of the richer country that I live in? I don't want to live in that world. So I think that when we don't live in a way that we have certain powers and privileges, we actually gain so much. You gain more love, you gain more community, you gain more connection. But yes, you give up your privilege, because that's exactly what we need to give up in order to actually find that world that we want, full of abundance. But as someone who has certain privileges but doesn't have others, I can't imagine what it's like to have more than me. But I would assume that, people who grow up having more than I do, more privilege than I do, more power, can't imagine what it's like to not have any of that. And I think their identification is so tied into that, that they just fear it so much, because if they lose that, they feel like they're losing themselves. And so like, as a powerful white male, you may not know anything else about being a white male than your power. And so you feel like if you lose that, you actually lose who you are. I'm assuming.
And it comes down to also just greed. I think you were also even touching upon when it comes to being an underrepresented community, but also understanding the privileges you have. Despite that, you kind of have guilt too, right? Especially, and I think we can speak for people who identify as underrepresented because they come from, different, like maybe immigrant backgrounds. Their parents might be immigrants. There is that guilt associated with, I made it out. I know that's something we've kind of touched upon a little bit in other episodes, how it can feel a bit of a burden and being told, things aren't that bad here in the US. Look how things are in elsewhere. But it's just like, despite that, we can't settle. That doesn't mean like everything that the US is doing is right. Just because we're not in the position where we're doing inhumane things blatantly, we still here in the US are doing a lot of things that are questionable and that do harm a lot of people. Things like Flint still doesn't have clean water. That's still a thing. There's so many things that are allowed to happen here in the US that don't get questioned as much as they should. And that's why it's hard. You're having to be thankful for what you have here in the States because, again, people in other countries might not necessarily have those same privileges, but at the same time, understanding that there's still work to be done here. And and just knowing that like the US is not a perfect country.
Yeah, no country is. I mean, I love Colombia with all my heart, but
Colombia has a dark history too. Latin America was part of the slave trade.
that doesn't just go away without reparations, right? So we need that everywhere.
So I'll be the first to say, no matter how much you love your country, criticize it with all your might.
Because it's never going to be perfect. We're human and we're never going to be perfect. But we have to always work towards better because it just takes time. And that's through different ways. That's through reform. That's through completely dismantling the system and building a new one. That's through healing. And that's through storytelling, really. And so I think on this podcast, we're trying to combine all of those as much as we can by bringing in different people from different walks of life that are doing different things. And I think the reason that we feel all these different emotions when it comes to immigration or just different policies affecting different communities that we've mentioned is because, at least for us, we come from two different cultures with very different values. And so the US is very individualistic. And I think that's why we are not encouraged to speak out on the country. I mean, that's a whole like nationalist pride as well. But also as an individualistic country, you're supposed to focus on yourself. You have to get your bootstraps on and get to work. And that's on you. The country's not at fault if you fail, right? It's on you. It's not all the systems that are working against you. No, it's your fault because you didn't get off the couch.
Which is so toxic because, again,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
saying the system is perfect or giving you all of these resources. And that's where it's very conflicting. I don't know if you experience the same thing, Tania, but I feel like within a lot of Mexican culture and just looking at my dad, he's the one who immigrated here to the US or Mexico because of like where he comes from. It was ingrained in him that the US was a perfect country. And no matter like what I point out, no matter what he sees on the TV of how like we're treated, awful things that are done to our community specifically, he is still adamant about like this country's everything. Like this country is like the safe haven. And it's very hard to accept at times, especially when we see all of the things going on with police brutality. And I try to explain to him, but this isn't okay. We do have to question it. We do have to speak out against it. And it's very hard to have those conversations. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners can relate to this because it's so crazy how the US has been able to ingrain these types of ideologies within us. Because like exactly what you're saying, we're very stereotypical in that way. That is our culture. The US is very like, it's on you. And it's ridiculous because we give so much to this country. We pay taxes. This country wouldn't be able to function without us as citizens. So like, why wouldn't the system work on behalf of us as well,
I actually don't think this current system and country as it is would have functioned at all if it wasn't for how it's still exploiting bodies and communities. It knows, the US government, they know that it would look like a completely different country if the immigration system actually worked, if people can actually get asylum, if people can actually apply for citizenship and there actually be a line to get into that citizenship, if there actually was a legit process rather than just an arbitrary yes or no, or all these different visas, all these different ways to make sure that it's harder for you.
And expensive.
If it wasn't for the prison system, oh yeah, exactly. So in Colombia, people grow up there and their main goal is to leave. Like that shouldn't be the case. You should be happy where you are as much as you can be. I do think that our parents, just any immigrant in general that feels like they're forced to leave wherever they are, all that trauma, it's gonna be really hard to when you finally find a safe place. And I do understand what they mean by safer place in certain areas. For example, where I live, I'm a mid-20s-year-old woman. I still run at night. I still run like at 10 p.m. sometimes. I still walk at that time by myself. I can't do that in Colombia, like at all, whatsoever. I don't think I'd make it home if I did that. I mean, of course, here that can happen to me as well, but I've generally been okay doing it. So I do think there are certain things, that's just one example, but I do think there are certain things when they mean like this country is safer. And that's just because of resources though. It's not because like it's not the amount of police we have for sure. It's not our security system. None of that is helping. What helps is that we have resources and people don't feel the need to go out and rob as much or to go out and commit crime as much because they feel okay with what they have in general.
We have these resources because we've exploited other countries to get them.
Mm-hmm.
We've exploited other communities. Again, it's really important to stress how the land that we are on is not ours. It comes from indigenous people. Like it's exploited so many Black and brown bodies for years and countries. That could be like a whole other episode where we can go into how the US has screwed over Latin America plenty of times and has been involved in their affairs. But that could be another episode. But yeah, to your point, we only have these resources because we've exploited other communities, other countries.
Yeah, so just being as people who are constantly navigating those two different cultures and trying to advocate for both countries at once, going back to like the individualistic versus collective culture, I think they both can be toxic actually. And the individualistic culture, we kind of touched on how it can be toxic if you're constantly told it's your fault that you didn't make it and not anything else. When clearly there are people with other resources, with more money, with more connections than you that just have a huge head start. And it's just like, that's not a level playing field. But in the collective culture, we also see where you are asked to give up so much of yourself sometimes for the community, for your family, for the country in a different way. And so here we're expected to do so much to contribute to the economy under the guise of, well, don't you want to do it for your career or don't you want to do it, to accomplish things? Whereas in the collective culture, I feel like we're asked to people please, essentially. I actually am very glad that I have both cultures because I do feel like I have a little bit of both. I'm very family oriented. And so I have that part from my Colombian side, which I'm very grateful for. But I also grew up in this nation where it's about working hard. And so you have both in different ways. And it's not that they don't work hard in other countries, but I think they do it for different reasons than we would do it here. And so constantly navigating those two cultures, I think that does play into like how we identify and live in this society where we live, in this LA area, in this California area, and just in general in the US.
Yeah, I agree. And like you mentioned, there's pros and cons within both ways of living. But like with anything, it's a balance, right?
Yeah, a balance and embracing those differences. Like I said, I'm glad I kind of have both because I mean, in general, in anything in life, right? Any extreme is not great. Any extreme is going to be detrimental. So just everything in moderation. And I think it's taught me a lot I think it's why I'm so open to embracing differences and finding similarities because I'm constantly embracing differences within myself and within my family and within people that maybe come from similar backgrounds. When I realized, oh, we have so much similarities, like your family's also from a different country or your family also has different cultures. I love going to my Egyptian friends' birthday. I love going to my Chinese friends' gatherings. Like, I just love the idea of learning from different cultures. And I think it's because I have multiple cultures in me that I realize there is so much that we can embrace when we do that and learn from each other. And I think that we do lose that a lot in an individualistic culture. It's hard to embrace differences when you're just so focused on worrying about yourself and how you can get further. So I do think that's a benefit from the collective culture.
I completely agree. And I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up this conversation and to leave it as a takeaway for our listeners. It is important to embrace differences. And with that same vein, take up space for who you are. Embrace the differences within yourself, as well as Tania's mentioning, like how she recognizes those within herself. I can completely relate. And there are times where, whether it's from guilt, whether it's from feeling like an outsider, whatever it is, there might be times where you feel like you aren't fully able to express who you are and where you come from. But don't be afraid to use your voice and take up space, because it is important. You matter, no matter like how different you are or how you fit in within the category of where you're surrounded by. You matter. So it is important to embrace differences in others, but also within ourselves.
Definitely. We're multifaceted and we're constantly evolving as we're growing. And when we each show up for each other and ourselves, that's how we get true representation. Because if it's just, oh, well, there's one Latina, in that group, in that table, whatever. Oh, then, we got diversity. We're chilling. Like, that's not.
No, that is not enough.
Yeah. Me being a Latina and Adriana being a Latina doesn't mean we're the same at all. And so you showing up for yourself and showing up for others, it's a way that we can actually not just be like diverse and the sugarcoating inclusive that you may see in the workplace, but actually true representation and eventually liberation. That is eventually the goal. That's the ultimate goal, that we can each just live our lives without having to worry about any of these categories. And I think during that time, we do need safe spaces as well. I know it can be difficult to be in those spaces sometimes when you feel like you're the odd one out. And so we do need those spaces where maybe it is just a Latina book club or whatever. I think I want to bring that up because I do feel like sometimes those get criticized, like, oh, well, that's not inclusive if you're just for one community. If it's just like Asians against Asian hate, like, hey, that's not inclusive. But
it is, because a lot of these groups welcome allies too.
Oh yeah, they need it. We all need it. Exactly. And they're the ones that understand the experience the most. And so why shouldn't they have their own group? When you're actively worked against, you need a safe space to just vent sometimes, to just cry, to just have someone say, I understand you, and actually feel comforted and actually feel like they do understand me, rather than just a like pat on the back. And I think that's why for this podcast, we wanted to create that safe space for as many people as can relate. I know we're not going to relate to everybody. I mean, we have limited experiences, and even the people that we bring on the show will have limited experiences because of just where we live, our backgrounds. But I think that's okay. We don't have to be the safe space for everyone. We just have to be a safe space for enough people where it feels like at least we can build some type of community, and there's going to be other communities elsewhere. So knowing that maybe our stories aren't for everyone, but at least we can show as much solidarity as we can to as many people as possible. Because I do think that if the minority wants to be the true majority one day, we really just all need to come together. And that's including with people who have privilege. I'm not saying like, let's all like get together and like, go get them. We need everyone. So that includes people who are maybe white males, but who are willing to give up the life that they know and that they grew up in to get a better life that includes everyone.
Yeah, I think, again, that wraps up our conversation. And once again, just thank you all for listening, for joining us throughout this season. We're really excited for what's to come. And we hope that you continue joining us on this journey of collective healing.
Yeah. If you haven't yet, follow us on Instagram. I think that's going to be the best way to keep up with us during this kind of break. We do plan to do things like during the break as well, online and offline. So we hope to see you in both areas.
We hope you all enjoyed this episode. Please follow us on whatever streaming platform you use.
To learn more, you can follow us on Instagram at closingthegappod or email us at closingthegappod@gmail.com with questions and feedback. Thanks for listening. Until next time.